There exists an entity in this world that you've likely only heard of in passing during history lessons, yet whose financial specter still wanders the corridors of Wall Street. Imagine a company whose value at the peak of its power would make Apple, Google, Amazon, and Saudi Aramco look like shawarma stands. If you were to combine the market capitalization of all today's tech giants, you still wouldn't come close to the figure this structure would be worth in modern terms. When we reflect on the origins of capitalism, on old money and unlimited power, our imagination paints images of the Rothschilds in their palaces or the Rockefellers signing checks. Those are the standard answers, aren't they? But we rarely mention the quiet, pragmatic Dutch corporation that actually rewrote the DNA of the global economy. They didn't just trade. They created the first transnational corporation in history, invented the stock exchange, and conducted the first IPO. And, most interestingly, this corporation is, in a sense, still here. It dissolved into the modern system, becoming its foundation. Brace yourselves. Today we will dive into the incredible, at times grotesque, but absolutely real history of the Dutch East India Company and the House of Orange. A story of how greed became a virtue and a corporation became a state. Let me transport you to 1580. The air in Europe is electric. A tectonic shift is occurring on the Iberian Peninsula that threatens to wipe out the young Dutch nation. The Spanish crown, through dynastic marriages and political intrigue, is absorbing Portugal. The Iberian Union is formed. This isn't just a merger of two countries on a map. It is the creation of a global monster. Spain and Portugal now act as a single organism, controlling sea routes from Brazil to Macau, from Angola to Goa. For the Dutch, this sounded like a death sentence. At that moment, the Netherlands was technically still fighting a grueling war for independence from the Spanish crown, the 80 Years' War. And suddenly, their enemy becomes the master of the oceans. Previously, Dutch merchants were middlemen. They picked up spices in Lisbon and distributed them across Europe. But the new Spanish monarch, Philip II, closes the ports to the rebellious heretics. The Dutch found themselves under blockade. They understood a small republic on the swamps cannot defeat a world empire with cannons. Their manpower was exhausted, and their army was tired. They needed a weapon of a new generation. A weapon that couldn't be cast from iron. And they decided to forge it from pure capital. In response to the threat, in 1602, something unprecedented happened. The government of the Netherlands forced several competing trading houses to cease their feuding and merge into a single structure. Thus was born the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC for short. We know it as the Dutch East India Company. The name can be misleading. East Indies in those times was a vague term Europeans used to designate everything east of the Cape of Good Hope: modern Indonesia, India, Japan, China. On paper, it looked like an ordinary trade union for importing nutmeg and pepper. But if you looked into the holds of their ships, you wouldn't just see goods. It was a machine of economic war. Imagine an Amazon that has the right to declare war, print its own money, execute criminals, and build fortresses. The VOC received powers from the state that previously belonged only to monarchs. It was a hybrid, a chimera stitched together from commercial ambitions and state interests. But the most radical innovation wasn't the cannons on the decks, but the papers in the safes. For the first time in history,
imperial expansion was financed not by taxes squeezed from peasants, nor by a royal treasury. It was financed by ordinary citizens. The VOC could scale in a way no emperor ever dreamed of, because its king was the market. Merchants plotted the routes, captains sailed the ships, but someone else stood behind the scenes, providing political cover for this venture. And here, the House of Orange enters the stage. You are probably asking, who are these oranges? They aren't just people who like the color orange, although that is precisely why the national color of the Netherlands is so bright. The House of Orange-Nassau was one of the most influential, yet simultaneously paradoxical dynasties in Europe. As of the early 17th century, they were in a strange position. They had titles, they had prestige, but they didn't have a kingdom. The Netherlands was a republic run by merchant oligarchs, the so-called regents. The Oranges held the position of stadtholders. Formally, this was the post of a governor or commander-in-chief, but effectively, a hired manager of the republic. They were pressured from all sides. Externally, by mighty Spain, which wanted them dead. Internally, by the wealthy merchants of Amsterdam, who didn't want to share power with quasi-monarchs. The Oranges didn't have vast landholdings like French dukes, nor silver mines like Spanish kings. The old feudal order was falling apart. The dynasty faced a choice: either vanish into history textbooks as another extinguished line, or adapt. They couldn't rely on feudal rent, so they bet on what they had: political influence and capital. The Oranges didn't manage the VOC directly. They didn't sit on the board of directors every day, but they became its chief lobbyists and protection. This alliance was a marriage of convenience. The company received legitimacy and military protection, and the dynasty received a financial resource independent of the whims of Parliament. Later, this connection became official. Imagine William IV and William V. These stadtholders effectively became hereditary CEOs of the corporation. They headed both the East India and West India companies, which dealt in the slave trade and piracy in the Americas. The Orange family turned corporate dividends into absolute political power. Without a crown on their heads, they became the richest people on the continent. When the VOC unfurled its sails toward the east, the Oranges rose with it. The company behaved not like a business, but like a sovereign. And that was the whole point. When your market capitalization exceeds the GDP of major European states, and your private army is capable of crushing the Portuguese fleet, you stop being just a legal entity. Let's talk about numbers that make your head spin. At the peak of its power, according to economic historians, the value of the VOC in modern money would reach $7.9 trillion. For comparison, the most expensive company today, be it Apple or Nvidia, barely reaches $3 trillion. That is, one Dutch company in the 17th century was worth as much as 3 modern tech giants combined. During its golden age, from the early 1600s to the mid-1700s, the VOC sent over 1 million Europeans to Asia. It was a true demographic pump. People boarded massive ships called Indiamen. These were masterpieces of engineering at the time, floating fortresses with holds as bottomless as the stomach of a whale. But who were these people? Not romantic explorers. They were hired employees of a megacorporation. Sailors, clerks, soldiers, accountants, carpenters. They went to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Java, and Bengal not for glory, but for a salary. This vast army of labor managed ports, guarded warehouses full of pepper, negotiated with sultans and rajas, and when negotiations hit a dead end, applied artillery. The VOC's success rested on three pillars: the state charter, monopoly, the financial elite of Amsterdam, and the strategic support of the House of Orange. The charter gave them the right to act on behalf of the state, conclude international treaties, mint coins, build cities. With a fleet of 150 merchant vessels, 40 warships, and a private army of 10,000 soldiers, the VOC redrew the map of the world. From the Persian Gulf to the artificial island of Dejima in Japan, the flag with the VOC logo flew everywhere. The center of this web became Indonesia. In 1619, Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Coen, a cruel and uncompromising man, captured the city of Jakarta. On its ruins, he built a new capital, Batavia, named after the ancient Germanic tribe of Batavians, ancestors of the Dutch. Today, we know this city as Jakarta. Batavia wasn't just a transit point. It was the administrative brain of the empire. The city was built in the image and likeness of Amsterdam, with canals, bridges, and brick houses, which, in a tropical climate, was not a very hygienic solution, but symbolically important. From here, Dutch governors dictated their will to the archipelago. For 300 years, Batavia remained the center of gravity. The legacy of this influence still permeates Indonesia, from the legal system to cuisine and language. But maintaining such a machine required astronomical sums. Outfitting a fleet, building forts, bribes to local rulers, it was a money pit. Kings usually solved such problems by borrowing from bankers at insane interest rates or simply robbing neighbors. The Dutch took a different path.
In August 1602, a revolution occurred. The VOC opened its doors to everyone. For the first time in history, an initial public offering, IPO, was conducted. Anyone, from a wealthy merchant to a maid who had saved a few guilders, could buy a share of the company. This changed the very psychology of wealth. Previously, wealth was something physical: land, gold, livestock. Now wealth became abstract, an entry in a ledger, a piece of paper promising a share of future profits. Power in Amsterdam belonged to the merchants, but only an external threat and a figure standing above the fray, the Oranges, could unite them. The dynasty understood. In conditions of constant war with Spain, feudalism was a path to defeat. They needed a system where risk is distributed among thousands of people while profit consolidates the nation. Thus, the secondary market was born. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange became the first place where shares could not only be bought, but also sold to another. This seems banal today, but back then it was like the invention of the wheel. Liquidity appeared, speculators appeared, traders began trading not stocks, but options, futures. They placed bets on what the price would be tomorrow. The entire toolkit of modern Wall Street was invented by guys in wide trousers and hats on the banks of the Herenkrocht Canal in the 17th century. Of course, the market needed fuel, and that fuel became good old FOMO, fear of missing out. VOC shares soared from an index of 100 in 1602 to 1,000 in the 1720s. Tenfold growth. Dividends were sometimes paid not in money, but in spices, which were worth more than gold. But what if the ship sinks? What if pirates seize the cargo? Previously, if your trading venture went bust, you were liable with all your property. Creditors could take your house, your clothes, even put you in a debtor's prison. The Dutch said, enough. They introduced the concept of limited liability. This is a legal shield that changed the business world. Now, if the VOC goes bankrupt,
the investor loses only what they invested in the shares. Their personal home, their savings under the mattress, remain untouchable. This untied the hands of capital. People stopped fearing investment. Risk became a calculated commodity. Financial innovations are like a virus. They cannot be contained in one country. And the main carrier of this virus became the man who united the fate of the Netherlands and Britain, William III of Orange. He was born a prince, but his power in the Republic was shaky. However, in 1688, fate smiled upon him. A crisis was brewing in England. King James II, a Catholic with absolutist ambitions, turned Parliament and the Protestant elite against himself. English lords were looking for a savior, and they found him in the person of William, who was married to James's daughter, Mary. William accomplished what is called the Glorious Revolution. In fact, it was a successful invasion. He sailed to England with a fleet that was 4 times larger than the famous Spanish Armada, another fact often forgotten. But he brought not only soldiers, he brought with him Dutch bankers, advisors, and, most importantly, the Dutch financial model. Sitting on the English throne, William III conducted a full rebranding of the state system. It was during his reign that the Bank of England was created, modeled on the Bank of Amsterdam. A system of government debt, bonds, was introduced. Now England could finance wars not by draining the treasury, but by borrowing from the future. This allowed Britain to eventually defeat France and build its own global empire. Irony of fate, the British Empire was built on blueprints stolen or borrowed from the Dutch. But the influence of the VOC reached even further west. Long before William, in 1609, the ship Halfmajen, flying the VOC flag, entered the harbor we today call New York. Captain Henry Hudson was looking for a route to Asia, but found Manhattan. In 1624, the West India Company founded the settlement of New Amsterdam there. If you look at the map of Lower Manhattan today, you will see a chaotic network of streets. This is the legacy of the Dutch. They built the city not as a religious colony, like the Pilgrims in Plymouth, but as a business project.
Famous Wall Street got its name from the protective wall, palisade, the Dutch built to defend against the indigenous population and the English. Broad Street was a canal. When the English captured the city in 1664 and renamed it New York, they changed the signs but left the operating system. The commercial spirit, tolerance for different religions, if it's profitable for business, the legal culture of contracts, all this was inherited. New York became the financial capital of the world precisely because Dutch DNA lay in its foundation. Nothing lasts forever under the moon, even a company worth $7 trillion. By the end of the 18th century, the VOC began to rot. The causes were classic for any empire: corruption, bloated bureaucracy, and changing market conditions. Company employees cared more about their own pockets than shareholders' dividends. The acronym VOC began to be deciphered by the people as vergaan onder corruptie, perished under corruption. Furthermore, the world was changing. Monopolies were becoming inefficient compared to the free market promoted by the British. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was the final nail in the coffin. In 1796, the VOC was nationalized. Its debts, and they were enormous, were taken on by the state. The charter that once granted boundless power quietly expired. But here is the paradox. The body died, but the spirit did not. The company disappeared, but its structural inventions, joint stock companies, transnational logistics chains, corporate law, became the standard for the whole world. Look at the modern Netherlands.
It is no longer a maritime empire with cannons. Now it is a financial empire with servers. The Netherlands remains one of the largest hubs for foreign direct investment. The numbers are staggering. Inbound investments exceed $4.3 trillion. Outbound, $5.2 trillion. This small country is a giant offshore node for global capital. And standing behind all this is still the House of Orange-Nassau. Yes, they have a constitutional monarchy. King Willem-Alexander cuts ribbons. But the family owns colossal assets. Their influence has transformed. They no longer send fleets. They own stock portfolios. A vivid example is Royal Dutch Shell. In 1907, a merger occurred between a Dutch oil company and a British transport firm. Thus arose an energy titan that dominated the world for a century. Pay attention to the word royal in the name. This is not just decoration. It is a sign of approval and participation by the royal family. Or take ING Group, a financial conglomerate which also grew on the yeast of the Dutch trading tradition. The descendants of those merchants who once founded the VOC today sit on boards of directors, manage investment funds, and shape European Union policy. Their names don't scream from newspaper headlines like Elon Musk, but their money loves silence. But we cannot end this story singing praises to financial genius and ignore the blood upon which this genius grew. The success of the VOC has a terrible price, and we are obliged to talk about it. The East India Company was not only a pioneer of capitalism, it was a pioneer of colonial genocide. The most terrifying example is the Banda Islands. This was the only place in the world where nutmeg grew at the time. To maintain the monopoly, Governor Jan Pieterszoon Coen ordered the extermination of the entire local population. Of 15,000 people, fewer than 1,000 remained alive. The rest were killed, starved to death, or sold into slavery. The islands were repopulated with Dutch planters and slaves brought from other regions. The Amboina Massacre, where English and Japanese traders were tortured and executed on suspicion of conspiracy. The massacre of Chinese in Batavia in 1740, when the city's canals turned red with the blood of thousands of civilians. The VOC created a system of forced labor that exhausted entire nations. They destroyed spice crops on other islands to artificially keep prices high. It was capitalism in its most predatory form. Profit above all, morality is nothing. When you look at the beautiful houses on the canals of Amsterdam, remember, many of them were built with money from human trafficking and violence. So, where have we arrived? From the wooden ships of the VOC to the oil platforms of Shell, a clear line can be traced. The House of Orange and the Dutch elites understood one fundamental truth before anyone else. Capital is stronger than the crown. A king can be executed, a dynasty can be overthrown, but a limited liability joint stock company? It is immortal. It simply reorganizes.
So, where have we arrived? From the wooden ships of the VOC to the oil platforms of Shell, a clear line can be traced. The House of Orange and the Dutch elites understood one fundamental truth before anyone else. Capital is stronger than the crown. A king can be executed, a dynasty can be overthrown, but a limited liability joint stock company? It is immortal. It simply reorganizes. They created the model of the corporate state, where war, trade, and politics merged into a single mechanism. This model has survived centuries. Today's corporations do not have their own armies, yet, but their influence on our lives, on laws, and on the ecology often exceeds the influence of national governments. The Netherlands no longer rules the seas,
but the Dutch invention, modern capitalism, rules the world. And this leads us to the main question, which is as relevant as ever. If power once belonged to monarchs by the grace of God, and now it belongs to markets by the grace of shareholders, then who really controls these markets? Who holds the scepter when the throne has become invisible? Perhaps the answer lies in the quiet offices of The Hague and Amsterdam, where descendants of old families still check stock tickers. If you watched until this moment, you are a true connoisseur of history. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell. Thank you for watching. Think critically, and see you in the next video.